This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everybody and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I'm a writer and film critic, and today I am delighted to be joined by a writer, Jason Nye, a writer who shares my publishing house, actually, from University Press of Kentucky. He has written a wonderful book about a filmmaker who deserves a reevaluation, Richard Fleischer, and the subtitle of the book, Journeyman, gives you a clue as to what that reevaluation should involve. And it's kind of interesting because we talked to Daniel Kramer like a month ago, and he's very much into the idea of changing the auteur canon and including a lot of filmmakers who are sort of skimmed over. And I would argue Richard Fleischer is one of those filmmakers who despite having some great films in his filmography, is often neglected. So first of all, thank you for joining me, Jason.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk.
How did you come across Richard Fleischer? What was your first encounter with him as a director when you sort of went, I've been watching a couple of this guy's films?
Well, probably the first time that I encountered him without knowing it was seeing 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea as a kid, and really enjoying that film. But as an adult, the first piece that I ever published was in Noir City magazine, and it was on Richard Fleischer. It was titled The Forgotten Man, and it was about his RKO noirs. And I can't remember which of those I saw first. It was probably The Narrow Margin, but I just remember watching those and really enjoying them and thinking, man, Follow Me Quietly is really good. Armored Car Robbery is really good. These films are really good. Why is nobody talking about this guy? Why does his name never show up on a list of great noir directors? And so I wrote the piece and had it published, and then went looking for a book on him. And the only thing that I could find was his autobiography, Just Tell Me When to Cry. And so I bought that and I read it and I thought, oh wow, he's not just a really good director, he's a really good writer as well. And if you haven't read that book, it's a it's a really great book, and it's been out of print for a very, very long time, but you can still track down a copy. And so as I got further and further into his filmography, I realized, oh, he made Soylent Green, he made The Boston Strangler, he made Dr. Dolittle. He made all of these different films. Why is there no biography of this guy? And after I published the piece, I thought, oh, well, once somebody writes one, I'll really enjoy reading it. And then a decade went by and nobody had written one. And so I thought, maybe I'll write it. And so that's what I did. I just decided, I think I'm at the point in my life now where maybe I could actually do this. So I'm going to give it my best shot. And that's what I did.
It's been something which we've heard a few times on this podcast of sort of write the book that you want to read, write the book where there's a gap on the shelf and you're thinking, why isn't there a book there? There should be a book between W and Y. And that sounds like that's been your motivation.
Yeah, I think as a writer, you're always looking for those underserved areas of whether it's biography or criticism, whatever it might be, you're always looking for a spot that's underexplored. And Fleischer's had a lot published on him in France, but it's all in French. And I don't read a lick of French, so I don't know what they've said. And I think there was another book that came out in Spanish a few years ago. I'd have to go back and check on that. But there's been nothing in English. No books in the English language. And so I thought, well, as a professor, as a scholar, you're always looking for that niche. And so I thought, oh, this would be a spot where not only could I write about something that is increasingly interesting to me, I could do something that nobody else is doing right now. And as a scholar, you always want to find something that is viable for a publisher. And so I remember the first conversation I had with Mark Fleischer, Richard's son, and I said, "Do you know of anybody else who's doing anything like this right now?" Oh, sorry, excuse me. I said, "Do you know of anybody else who's doing anything like this right now?" And he said, "No, I don't know of anybody." I thought, okay, good. So I'll have this lane to myself, because you never know. I mean, you look at films, and there's always these situations where all of a sudden two films that have the exact same plot come out. As a child of the 90s, I remember Armageddon and Deep Rising, the summer of 1998. And there's been others as well, but I just didn't want to end up being in a situation where all of a sudden I'd written a book, and 6 months before my book comes out, another biography of him comes out at the same time. So it was nice to know, that I would have that lane, and that it would be coming out from University Press of Kentucky. I was really happy to have it accepted by them because of all the great work that they do in terms of film studies.
Yeah, I always think of Dante's Peak and Volcano as being one of those.
Yeah.
When you wait years for a volcano movie to come along, and you get two at the same time. Let's talk a little bit about Fleischer's background, because I was at Pordenone Silent Film Festival last year, and they had a whole season of shorts by his father, Max Fleischer, the Ink Pop shorts, and I thought these were amazing. And I know, obviously, maybe today you can explain who Max was, Richard's father. But at the time that these shorts came out, he was famous. He was like he was famous in the world of animation when Walt Disney was still sharpening his pencils.
Yeah, Max was the leader in the 20s, and that's when Dick grew up. And so he remembers walking down the street in New York City, people recognizing his dad on the street all the time, going to these phenomenal movie palaces in New York City, and seeing his dad's cartoons, and seeing his older sister Ruth perform on the stage. And so he grew up very much in that industry as it was just coming into the fore. And his dad they'd hop in the car at night, and his dad would drive him across town, and to the rehearsals they would be doing at some of these shows. And so, Dick would be 7, 8 years old in the theater, 10 o'clock at night, 11 o'clock at night, midnight, trying to stay awake while he's watching all this stuff go on. And his dad loved movies. So his dad would take him to movies all the time, whether they were appropriate for a little boy or not. And and so he grew up around all of that. It was something very familiar to him. But as he got older, it was not the his first choice. He did not think he was going to become a filmmaker. He never, his dad was known for his animation, and he always said, when people asked him, "Why didn't you go into animation?" He said, "I can't draw. I have no skill in that area whatsoever." And so, he thought, by the time that he was done with high school, he said, "Oh, I'm going to go to college and study psychology. I'm going to be a psychiatrist." And so that's what he went to college for. He got his degree in psychology from Brown. And so he was not thinking, "I'm going to follow in my father's footsteps" at all. But eventually, the more he got into the theater as an adult, the more he thought, I actually do kind of love directing in the theater, but I don't know if I should do this. And, his dad sat him down and said, "Listen, you clearly love this. Give it a year. Try it for a year. Go to Yale for your MFA. Go to their school of drama. If you don't like it, you've just lost a year, but you've also gained clarity in terms of what you really want to do. But if you do love it, then that's a sign that you should essentially keep going." And so he followed his dad's advice and went to Yale, and was really groundbreaking in terms of his approach to the theater. He was doing theater in the round, which nobody else was doing except for some little tiny place out in Seattle, which was basically um, no stage, performing right in the middle of a crowd, which is circled around you. And it was really experimental for the time, and he did really well with it and made a name for himself in that. And so that was kind of his origin story for getting into directing and figuring out how to work with actors and deciding that this was a viable career path for him moving forward.
So how does this get him to Hollywood then and filmmaking?
A guy named Arthur Willey just shows up one day at one of his plays because he's heard about him and said, "Would you like to come to Hollywood? I work for RKO. How would you like to be a director?" And
That's
so,
pretty good. I mean, there's a run of luck happening here. He has a great luck in his father being in the industry to some degree. Has great luck in his father being giving him great advice and being very
mhm.
accepting of what he wants to do, which is not always going to be the case. And then yeah, to be headhunted essentially by a studio is also fair. I mean that luck might run out soon, but let's
Right.
keep let's see how far we go.
Well, he didn't go to Hollywood right away because RKO was, if you're listening to this, you probably have a familiarity with RKO and how chaotic everything was on the organizational and business side of RKO for a very long time. And this was even before Howard Hughes took over. And so Willie told him, don't come out yet. What we're going to do is we're going to send you to RKO Pathé in New York, and you're going to work on our newsreels. And that's where you're going to learn the art of filmmaking. And so he worked there for a couple of years, and he said that that was just a tremendous educational experience. Just being able to work in that pressure cooker environment in which these reels of film would come in, and they'd have a day or two to cut them into a story. He would screen the raw footage. He would take notes as it was going. He would edit it down. He would create voiceovers, get the music if it needed music, and then they would ship them out the door to be shown in front of feature films. And so he said, learning how to work quickly, learning how to edit on the fly, that was just foundational for him, and would come in really handy because by the time he does get to Hollywood, he's not an A-list director right away. He's making B movies where he's got 2 weeks, to put together an entire feature. So having worked on those newsreels for years was just instrumental for him.
And so when he does start working on these B movies, he's sort of got an editor's eye as well. He's able to use that experience to sort of shoot in camera and edit in camera, sorry, and also with the theatrical training that he's had or experience that he's had, he can sort of block things quickly. And I mean, here and in your book, I really got a feeling that this idea of the journeyman shouldn't be something which is a criticism. It should be something which actually should be leaned into. There is a craftsmanship to it that needs to be admired.
Yeah, I think that that discussion, as I was getting further and further into the research on this and watching all of his films and seeing what he's able to accomplish, I thought, I don't know why this has been denigrated the way that it has or seen as less than the auteur. In the common conception of the auteur, it's kind of this it's this heroic individual who can push back against the system and can impose a vision onto a picture and have a personal style that you can trace over and over and over again from film to film. And while I think that there's virtue in that, why can't there also be virtue in the idea of a director who can come in, can take something that is given to him, not something that he chooses, but an assignment, bring a real sense of craftsmanship to it, actually bring a sense of the personal touch to it, maybe not as quite as distinct as a Wells or a Hitchcock, but it's still there. And as I watched his films, I thought, oh, I see that shot repeated in this film from the 50s. It's also in this film from the 80s, and I didn't do too much of that in the book. The press didn't want me to do too much film analysis because there's so many films in his career that the book would end up being 200,000 words. And they asked me for 90,000, I negotiated up to 100,000, then I turned in 140,000. So, so I thought, I only have so much space here. So I didn't want to get into the nitty gritty of, well, this shot was in this film, and then it was in this film, and then it was in this film. So see how important that is. I wanted to have a narrative first and foremost. And, but to circle back to what we were talking about with Fleischer, yeah, I thought, why isn't this more celebrated? That somebody could come in and just make, I mean, what we're all looking for as the audience is just a good movie, right? We just want to see a good movie. We want to see compelling characters. We want to see interesting plots. We want to see challenging themes. And if you're judging by that metric, so many of Richard Fleischer's films clear that bar. So just because the personal stamp wasn't necessarily as distinct as some other directors, I just came to really believe that that argument had no merit.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even today we talk about people like Ron Howard, and people use it as a criticism that he doesn't have this particular signature style. But, on the other end of the spectrum, you have someone like Wes Anderson, who his films are kind of nothing but his signature style, or certainly, I think there's room in the cinematic world for both of those approaches. So let's talk about we got Fleischer. He's at RKO. He's making B movies. He's making these really solid noir films that at first grabbed your interest, and one in particular grabs the interest of the new owner of RKO, who we've already indicated, Howard Hughes. And this, and even though he's made this great movie, Howard Hughes is sort of like, oh, this could be an A movie now. I'm going to take it off you, and instead of releasing it, I'm going to start fiddling with it.
Yeah, he makes several films. He makes Bodyguard, the Clay Pigeon, Follow Me Quietly, Armored Car Robbery, and then he gets to The Narrow Margin. And if you haven't seen The Narrow Margin, you should definitely watch it. Warner Archive just put out a beautifully restored new version or new restoration on Blu-ray. It looks the best I've ever seen it by far. And so he makes this film in 13 days, and Hughes loves it and says, "Oh, we should remake this. Let's scrap this version, and maybe we'll remake it as an A picture with Robert Mitchum and Jane Russell." And the film just sits because he has not. Hughes had a unique relationship with time. He would often just let films sit for months or for years without screening them. And then when he did screen them, he would have these crazy ideas for what to do with them. And I mean, there's so many films in the late 40s and early 50s at RKO that he just butchered because he thought, this should go a different way. And so one of those films was His Kind of Woman, which John Farrow had originally directed. And then he thought, well, I want this to have a different third act. And Fleischer was really frustrated with The Narrow Margin not being released. And he made that displeasure known, and he refused to direct, one of the pictures that they wanted to have him follow up on, The Narrow Margin, which hadn't been released yet. And he said no. And then he got suspended. And then he had to personally appeal to Hughes to say, hey, can you let me out of my contract? I just want to go somewhere else. And Hughes came up with a deal. He said, okay, I'll release The Narrow Margin if you fix His Kind of Woman. It should only take a week or two. And it took several months and a lot of money. I think about 800 some $1,000. And the story, I don't want to give too much away because it's in the book, and it's definitely worth delving into all of the crazy details that happened with this. But Fleischer did end up directing pretty much the entire picture twice because they replaced one of the bad guys with an actor who then they replaced again with Raymond Burr. And so by the time that the film was done, it had been filmed 3 times. And it was just the fact that it's as coherent as it is and that it works as well as it does is incredible. And Fleischer's name is not on it. John Farrow's name is still on it as the credited director, even though Fleischer pretty much directed almost all of what you see on the screen. It's such a funny movie. It's got action. I think it has Vincent Price's best performance. I mean, it is very much worth seeing. So I'm trying to keep. I'm going to loop back so you can edit these out.
That's okay. That's okay.
Yeah. And so it's very much worth seeing. And Hughes really liked what he came up with. And so he said, okay, now we can release the narrow margin. But he said, I'll also release you from your contract, like we said. So he releases him from the contract. He goes to work. Fleischer goes to work for Stanley Kramer for the first time. And that ends up being a great and long lasting friendship in his life. And even after he leaves, though, Hughes can't help himself because he hires William Cameron Menzies to do reshoots on the narrow margin. And you can see where just a few spots where there's some inserts where he makes some changes to the film. They don't ruin the film. The film's still a great film. But even at that point, Fleischer was not able to do anything about it because he had left the studio and, he had no say. But The Narrow Margin does come out in 1952, 2 years after he made it. It's a big hit. And to this day, remains one of the great B noirs in the film noir canon.
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely recommend it. And that Blu-ray, as you said, looks amazing. So well worth picking up if you have the opportunity to. Um, yeah, so he gets away from Hughes finally at this convoluted, adventurous way that we've already which you've outlined. And yes, absolutely. Don't tell all the twists and turns because, of course, we want our listeners to read the book. But what is the first film post these noirs, which sort of establishes him as a director, and at what point does that happen?
Well, that's a tricky question because one of the things that I spend my time talking about in the book is that at so many points in his career, the film that should have vaulted him up to the top echelon of directors didn't end up doing that. And I trace how and why that happens over and over again. For instance, the first film he makes after he leaves RKO is a film that's not well known today at all, but is really well regarded among people who do know it, is The Happy Time. He makes that with Charles Boyer. He makes that for Stanley Kramer. And so that's his first A picture. It's recognized by the DGA. It's a really good film, and it has Bobby Driscoll in it, the child actor Bobby Driscoll, and that ends up being the thing that helps him get the job directing 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But so he does that, he makes that, and then he's kind of a free agent, right? Which that's the other part of his career that's tricky because he liked the stability of studio filmmaking.
Mhm.
He hated to just sit by the phone and wait as a freelancer for somebody to make a call to him and say, "Hey, will you come direct this film?" I mean, he hated that. He had to be working. He made a ton of films, and I think at some points, I think it probably would have helped his career had he been a little bit more patient. But he did not want to stop working. He didn't want to take breaks. So he makes the Happy Time. He's sitting around waiting for a call. He gets the opportunity to make a 3D film called Arena. So he does that during the 3D craze. And then he's sitting around again, waiting, and he gets a call from Disney to say, "Hey, Walt Disney wants to see you." And he thought, why does Walt Disney want to see me? Because by that point, I mean, Disney had just become the powerhouse in animation. And due to a lot of factors, the Fleischer Studios had really fallen by the wayside. I think at that point, Max was up like making educational films in Detroit. I mean, there really was not the competition was over and Walt Disney had won. And so he thinks, well, my dad hates Walt Disney. Like these guys have been rivals for forever. Why on earth does this man want to see me? So he decides to take the meeting. So he goes to Disney Studios, and Walt brings him in and says, hey, I wanted to show you these, drawings for this film. We're going to make 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. He says, oh, you're going to make it animated. He said, no, we're going to make it live action and we want you to direct it. And he was really, and he said, do you know who I am? Do you know who my dad is? and, and he said, yeah, I do. And I think you're the best person for the job. And he said, well, I'm interested, but I'm not going to betray my dad. I need to talk to him first about this. And so, he goes back, he calls his dad and says, Dad, I got this opportunity to direct this. It's the first big budget CinemaScope film in Disney's history. And there's a lot riding on it. Disney's in financial trouble. There's always been these periods of time where Disney's been in financial trouble. But they're stretched very thin because Walt is building Disneyland at the time. And so there's a lot of money going into that. And this is by far the biggest budget for a live action film that Disney's ever made. So the film needs to do well, because if it bombs, Disney could go under. And so he calls his dad, and his dad says, well, of course you should take the job and tell Walt he has great taste in directors.
Mm.
So Dick takes the job, and that's the film. That's his first blockbuster, because that film does really, really well, becomes a classic in Disney history. But to your question about, well, is this the film? What's the film that really establishes him as a director? As a kid, when I would watch Disney films, I was under the impression that Walt Disney did everything, right? That he was, because it was always his name on everything. So, when you're 6 or 7 or 8, you're thinking, well, this is a Walt Disney picture. This, like, he must have made it. He's responsible for everything in the film. I had no concept of the legions of animators and directors and all of these other people who worked at Disney. And for Fleischer, that's what happened to him. People, he has this story in his memoir where he says, for decades, he'd tell people he directed 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And people were like, oh, really? You made that film? I had no idea. Because first and foremost, those films were seen as Disney pictures. And so Walt Disney, gets the credit for 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. It doesn't make Richard Fleischer a household name. It does get him some recognition within the industry, and he does get a series then of good contracts at 20th Century Fox. But it's not Richard Fleischer's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. It's Walt Disney's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea.
And Walt Disney didn't even use his own signature. His signature was designed by one of his animators. So,
Which is that's very indicative of that process and what went on during that time.
Absolutely. I mean, in many ways, way ahead of his time, Walt Disney, in terms of his own personal branding, his own way of, absorbing, and of course, vertical, what all the things they talk about now in terms of vertical marketing and everything, having the merchandise and having the, all under the same roof, as you mentioned, Disneyland being opened. I think there's a really interesting part in your book where the accountants come round and are visiting the set because they could pull the plug because Disney has basically overextended himself in financing the film as well.
Yeah, because he's trying to finance that and Disneyland at the same time. And, so they need $1 million. And so these accountants are coming by and they're screening the footage to say, is this worth finishing or not? And he didn't need the $1 million to finish the film. He needed the $1 million just for general financial purposes at the studio. I mean, that's how stretched thin they were. So it was a big deal that film came out and was such a huge blockbuster. It basically helped save the studio at a really critical point of the company's history.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that was a very sort of this situation sort of repeats itself as well for other big films that he makes and films that are very famous. So he makes The Vikings, and he has Kirk Douglas again, who's starred already at 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. It's very much sort of him and his ego and personality. You have fantastic Voyage, and lots of people concentrate on the special effects, and he feels kind of resentful that, like, come on, I made the film, and don't I get any, don't I get any praise?
Yeah, when he was making Fantastic Voyage, again, the special effects were the star. And I went back and I watched that film with some of my kids. And I mean, that film holds up so well. They were just enamored with it. And that's what I realized was that um, a lot of these films, particularly for younger viewers, they work really well. My oldest son loved 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. They loved Fantastic Voyage. They even loved Dr. Dolittle, which I I have a really hard time just making it through that film. But they loved it. So I think that he deserves more credit for those things because yeah, like with Fantastic Voyage, those were cutting edge special effects at the time, and a lot of the practical effects still look fantastic. The in camera effects, and he said later on, he said, you know, that's my most completely directed film. I was there from the very beginning, working with the special effects team, coming up with solutions. Like I was front and center through that whole process. But again, it's one of those films that's kind of like a cult item now, that certain audiences still really enjoy. But the name Richard Fleischer is not necessarily associated with that. It's because of the premise, and it's because of the way that the premise was so beautifully executed that that's what gets the credit for the film, without it being associated with his name necessarily.
I mean, when I was reading the book, and I've come across Richard Fleischer's films, from my viewing history, from when I was young, as you said, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. You've most of us will have watched it when we were children on, at Christmas or sometime like that. And then, Fantastic Voyage, Soylent Green, which is a perennial favorite, Dr. Dolittle. And I'm reminded of some of these modern directors like Steven Soderbergh, who are consciously trying to do a film in every genre. And here you have a filmmaker who's not only doing a film in every genre, but he's doing a film in every genre, which is like the biggest version of that film. It's the biggest musical that's been being made up until that point. It's the biggest science fiction film that is being made up until that point. And you're really on the cutting edge of this kind of Hollywood entertainment.
Yeah, Tora, the biggest war film up to that point, right? I
Yeah,
mean,
right.
yeah, he's doing, and that's again where I say that, you know, the ideal journeyman make any can make a good picture in any genre. And that in and of itself is a really valuable skill. Hitchcock couldn't do that, right? There are other directors. I don't think you could say Wells could do that. I mean, there are directors who have found a lane and excelled incredibly in that particular lane. But to be able to jump from one genre to the next and make the Soylent Green, make Fantastic Voyage, make the Boston Strangler, make the Narrow Margin. I mean, there are not many directors in Hollywood history who can lay claim to that sort of accomplishment. But because of the experimentation within those genres, because of the fact that you might not recognize that signature stamp from, say, the Narrow Margin to the Boston Strangler to Soylent Green to whatever, to Mandingo to whatever it might be.
10
Um,
Rillington Place. I mean, 10 Rillington
10 Rillington
Place is,
Place.
is an absolutely astonishing film. Compulsion is an absolutely astonishing film.
Yeah.
Um, and you're right. I personally, I would hold my hand up and say, no, I've never really strung those films together and thought this is the work of the same hand. I've always, I might enjoy those films and admire those films individually, but I mean, in fact, going to compulsion, isn't this, and this is what I was thinking when I was reading your book, that chapter in particular, I was thinking, okay, this is really where you see the clash of the auteur in Orson Welles, who's there as an actor, and
Mhm.
Fleischer, who is on board. And you can see that Wells is kind of envious of Fleischer's um, position, and just the fact that he's directing a film, and Wells is like, well, I wish I was directing this.
Yeah, so that was the first of two films that Fleischer and Wells made together. And Fleischer had established himself as a master of cinemascope, widescreen composition throughout the 1950s to 20th Century Fox. He made the first cinemascope film that was ever made for under $1 million with Violent Saturday, which is a tremendously underrated film. The way that he uses long takes in that film to establish the relationships between the characters and the different layers of society and how they interact with each other and how they move between each other uh, is just impeccable. That's a beautifully made film. So he goes on to do that. He's making really thoughtful pictures again with these scripts that are being handed to him. I mean, there is not. I think The Girl in the Red Velvet Swing is a uh, it feels utterly contemporary. It's an incredibly made film. So there are really no misses at 20th Century Fox leading up to Compulsion. So he gets this job directing Compulsion, and it's a fictionalized retelling of Leopold and Loeb, the famous murder case from the 1920s. And Wells is playing the Clarence Darrow character.
Which is already, sorry to interrupt, which has already
Yeah,
inspired Hitchcock's Rope as well at this point.
right. Yes, that was made about a decade earlier, and so Fleischer really wants to do this film. It's with Daryl Zanuck's son, Richard Zanuck. It's the first film that the younger Zanuck will be producing, and he knows, oh, I'm going to get to direct Orson Welles. This will be incredible. Wells had just made Touch of Evil, which Universal had taken away from him in the editing process, and that was supposed to be his big Hollywood comeback. And it didn't work out that way. And so Wells is once again kind of on the sidelines as a director. And here comes this guy who has figured out how to work within the studio system to make good films. And, that's not Wells. That's never been Wells. And I'm not putting all the blame for that on Wells. That, there's reams of scholarship that detail the complexities of who's responsible for what at various points in the careers of in the career of Orson Welles and the Hollywood system. But regardless of where the blame or responsibility lies, um, Fleischer has this really good directing gig, and Welles is relegated to acting in the film. And this is where Fleischer's psychological training comes into play because he was a very accomplished psychology student. He would have made, I mean, I think he did become a psychiatrist of sorts when he became a director because he knew how to work with actors. I mean, if you listen to the testimonies of some of the actors who worked with him, they'll say he was one of the best directors I ever worked with because he understood actors, he understood how to work with actors, and he was very proficient, very skilled at being able to know what each actor needed and giving it to that actor. So on that film in particular, he had Dean Stockwell, who was a method actor, and then he had Wells, who despised the method. He had competing approaches, and he knew from the very beginning, I'm going to have to handle these people who aren't getting along on set. I'm going to have to handle them all in a very individualized way. And so he put his psychological training um, into effect with all of those relationships, and it worked really well just in terms of the finished product. I mean, I recently saw that film. It was screened as part of the Film Forum's Richard Fleischer retrospective, which was happening in May. And I saw that film with an audience, and it just held the audience spellbound the entire time. I mean, it still works so well as a drama. I mean, I think that outside of Harry Lime in The Third Man under Carol Reed, Fleischer got Welles's best performance in a film that Welles did not direct himself when he wasn't directing himself. I mean, I think he managed to find a way to get Welles to dial down the theatricality, and give just a really subtle and nuanced performance that I mean holds up tremendously today.
Yeah, absolutely. And as well as that performance, and there's the tour de force scene at the end of the summation that he makes
Hmm.
in the case. Another performance that was much more appreciated by the actor themselves, because Wells, of course, sort of. I don't know. I'm not going to spoil it, but he wasn't necessarily very gracious. Let's say that.
Yeah.
Um, but Tony Curtis in the Boston Strangler, that was a
Hmm.
performance which was kind of unexpected from an actor like Curtis, who'd previously been known for sort of as a pretty boy, a great comic actor. Some Like It Hot, obviously being the height of that. But he'd been in films like Trapeze and comedy sort of capers like The Great Race and things like that. But The Boston Strangler was an entirely different film, and it was a film that Tony Curtis sort of recognized he'd been sort of gifted by Fleischer.
Well, Fleischer very much fought for that. I mean, they had one of the things that I discovered when I was doing my research for the book was, the studio very much did not want Tony Curtis in that role. They had a list of dozens of actors that they were considering for the part. Um, Tony Curtis was not on it, and so Fleischer really fought for him to play Albert DeSalvo. And there's a funny story. It's Tony really wanted it, so he put on this prosthetic nose, and he changed his hair and got all dressed up, and he took these Polaroids of himself and gave them to Dick Fleischer. And Fleischer takes them in, and puts them on the desk in front of Richard Zanuck, who is now, a big producer at 20th Century Fox. And Zanuck says, "Oh, yeah, that guy looks great. Like, who's that? He could play the Boston Strangler." And Fleischer says, "That's Tony Curtis. This is the guy I've been arguing for the whole time." And so that's how he got the part. And that film in particular, yeah, I mean, that is a real, what Fleischer liked to do was he liked to marry style to substance. So, for instance, it's the only film where he used the multi-screen imagery, because he said in an interview around that time, it has to make sense for the narrative. You can't just force it into a picture where it doesn't make sense. It has to reinforce the themes of the picture. And so, it remains to this day the only film from that era that I think uses the multi-screen imagery in an effective way, in a way that reinforces what the picture's trying to say. And it also helps bring out Curtis's performance. I mean, it really is a tremendous performance, and went completely unrecognized by any of the awards bodies. The film itself was shut out of all of the awards. I mean, it was for Fleischer, it should have been the film that again kind of rescued his reputation after the debacle that was Dr. Dolittle. But it just because of the performance he was able to get out of Curtis, which not a lot of directors probably would have been able to do. Late in life, Fleischer said, "Listen, I just like actors, and I respect actors. And there are some directors who don't. They just see actors as a means to an end. But I actually like actors. I like working with actors." And, by the end of his life, actors, the actors he worked with returned that love to him, through the respect that they showed him and the way they would show up at retrospectives, to praise him. He had a great relationship with actors. And so that's part of his career that doesn't really get talked about all that much, is the way in which he was able to elicit great performances, from actors. In that way, he's emulating. He sees the relationship with actors as more important than the stylistic consistency from film to film. And he's getting that. I don't know if he's consciously getting this from William Wyler, but William Wyler was his favorite director. And if you look at William Wyler, Wyler for a time faced the same criticisms. It was, oh, he doesn't have enough of a personal stamp. He's jumping from genre to genre, and you can't always tell that it's a Wyler picture. But if you look at Wyler's career, he has a record number of Oscar nominations. His actors have a record number of Oscar nominations and wins, because he believed in the primacy of the relationship between the director and the actor. And so for Fleischer, that's what he was trying to emulate in his own career. It was, yes, I'm going to bring all of my skill to bear on the way that the film looks, but it's not going to be the film it could be unless I have the best possible working relationship with these actors and bringing out the best performances from them.
And as we come towards the sort of well, actually, one point I wanted to make, because you mentioned Doctor Dolittle, and of course this production's become infamous partly because of Mark Harris's wonderful book Pictures from a Revolution, or Scenes from a Revolution. It has two titles, I think, in the UK and the US. Um, but that gets nominated for Best Picture Oscar, even though he doesn't get nominated for Best Director Oscar. And there's an element that it's such a crazy production. It's so over the top, and there's so many things are going wrong. Sexy Rexy has gone crazy, and the animals are all over the place doing terrible things. Um, and just the very fact that he holds it down wins him sort of inside respect in terms of the studio. And that means that he sort of becomes, and this again sort of feeds into the idea of the journeyman, he becomes somebody who they might parachute into a difficult production to sort of save the day. And he's also somebody who won't walk away from a production, no matter how difficult it gets, he'll finish it.
Yes, he never walked away from a film once he started it. And there were films where other directors, the Vikings, I mean, the fact that he survived on the Vikings was incredible. Yeah, Dr. Dolittle. I mean, there were other films as well, but yes, he took over five different films from directors who were fired or quit or had to move on for one reason or another. And that kind of becomes his late in his career, that kind of becomes his calling card. I mean, there are three pictures in a row late in his career where this happens. It happens on Ashanti, it happens on The Jazz Singer, and then it happens on Tough Enough. And he just kind of he likes to fix things, right? He likes to
Mm.
solve problems. He likes to fix things. So, at a time, particularly at a time when the big studios weren't hiring him anymore, he's the guy, he's the fix it guy that comes in and saves a picture. The Jazz Singer is the most notable of those because that film becomes a big hit. Audiences love it, critics hate it, but audiences love it. And I mean, Sidney Furie was directing that, and it was a disaster. And so Jerry Leiter, that he has to let him go, and or Barry Spikings has to let him go, and Fleischer comes in, and everyone's going, "Oh, what is going to happen here? Is this film even going to get finished?" And he comes in, and he's just that steady presence, who can bring all of his skill to bear on bringing in a picture on time, on budget. He does that on The Last Run, which is one of my favorite Fleischer pictures. John Huston walks off of that one right in the middle, and Fleischer comes in, and the story behind that is, right after he had finished making 10 Rillington Place and then See No Evil, Huston walks off The Last Run, and this is how quickly he could work, how quickly Fleischer could work. He gets a phone call over the weekend, and from these MGM execs who are panicked about what's going on with this film. They fly him from England to Spain, pitch him on the film. He meets with the screenwriter. They create a new continuity. He scouts locations on a Monday, starts shooting on Tuesday, and finishes the film 3 weeks earlier than Houston had originally planned on finishing it. So, I mean, it turns out great. I mean, it's a great movie. And and it just speaks to like his abilities as a director to be able to move quickly, work well, get the film done. And you think about that just outside of the realm of the art itself. You're saving when you're doing that, you're saving a lot of people's jobs, right? Like
Yeah.
you are doing, like, you are coming in and you are you are creating stability for a lot of people on these productions who might lose their jobs otherwise, who might lose their health insurance. Like there's a practical benefit to being able to do that outside of the art itself that never really gets talked about. But you know, you have to, I think it's worth thinking about it from that perspective as well. That, you know, he's doing something good here for a lot of people by coming in and saving these films, even if with a film like Tough Enough, like, is it a great film? No. You know, but there's still some worthwhile things in it. And, you know, he helped a lot of people along the way. Otherwise, the film just would have collapsed. So, you know,
Yeah.
that's worth praising, I think.
Absolutely, reputational damage. You know, it might not be your fault that the film has gone belly up, but at the same time, oh, that's on your resume. That film that never saw the light of day. And
Mhm.
I'm interested actually in terms of the jazz singer. Just sort of, what kind of percentage of the finished film is Fury? What kind of percentage is Fleischer?
Yeah, so I believe pretty much the first act of the film is Furies. I'd have to go back and look at the exact numbers. They're in the book,
Right,
but I think it's about two-thirds Fleischer, one-third Fury. And so I
right,
think all of the stuff in the first half hour or so is Furies, and then just about most of the stuff that's after, I believe, or all of the stuff that's after that is Fleischer's.
right. And the
Yeah.
final film I wanted to talk about before we wrap up is it's a film I've not seen yet, but it's gone to the top of my watch list, which is Mandingo. What the hell's that film like?
Oh, I mean the story of that film is in the book. There's a whole chapter on it. And
Sure,
that
yeah,
I mean
that's
that
why I
movie
want to
if you
see it.
yeah, it is. I mean it's really something.
Right.
It's one of those films. So it came out in 1975. So you're kind of at the height of the critical praise for the auteur and Fleischer's still working. You know, it's interesting because he basically stops being a studio director in the early 70s. You know, he goes over to England, he makes 10 Rillington Place, which is, you know, just a knockout of a film. And then he makes See No Evil, which I also got to see with the crowd and which also still really holds up today. And you know, he's making these films over in Europe. He comes back, he makes Mr. Majestic.
Oh, such a good film that, by the way.
Yeah.
I know Charles
Yeah.
Bronson's a bit of an ass on the production of that, but what a great movie.
Yeah, so he makes that with Walter Mirisch, who he's been friends with for a really long time. He makes the Spikes Gang with him too, but right before that, which I actually think is pretty underrated Western. And then he teams back up with Dino De Laurentiis, who he'd worked with on Barabbas in the early '60s. And you know, he has this idea to make this film about slavery in antebellum America and down in Louisiana. And it is the craziest movie. I mean, as I just couldn't believe when I was watching it. I just thought, wow, it is both a serious exploration of slavery and a utter exploitation of some of the content at the same time. It's just these two things are constantly in tension with each other. Dino had originally floated the idea of an X-rated version, and Fleischer said, "I'm not making an X-rated version. You know, I will walk off this production before it even begins if you push that." And so they ended up with an R. And I mean, it's one of those films that was a big hit. Audiences really liked it, but again, critics just savaged it. But then kind of has gone through a reappraisal. You know, 25 years down the line, people started to go back and look at it and realize that, oh, there's more going on here than just the lurid content, because it is by far the most lurid film in his entire filmography. I mean, there's all sorts of crazy stuff that goes on in that picture. But he wanted, I mean, he was a director who wanted psychological realism in his pictures. That was his longtime passion. All the way back to the film noirs, up through the end of his career, he was just a real he wanted to make pictures that were psychologically realistic. And you can see him straining for that in that film. I don't think he always succeeds, but yeah, it's one of those films where when the title itself became a punchline for so long, and it became sort of notorious as a picture, but I think it's continually being reappraised, and looked at to say, oh, what actually is going on here? What is the intent behind some of these things? Does it always work? Does it not work? It's an interesting film. I don't know. I can't give it like a traditional recommendation.
Well,
Um,
okay, well, let me jump in there and say, well,
yeah,
if you were to say to someone, "I want you to watch this Fleischer film. This is the film that most Fleischer's Fleischer." What would you, what would you? I mean, it's a paradox because we've just spent the whole hour talking about how he does all these different things. But what would be the
yeah.
one you would point to and say this really kind of sums him up as a director?
I think Compulsion, and
Mm.
that's the one he often cited as his favorite film, because the more he cares about the material, the better the film often ends up. So he was a passionate opponent of capital punishment, and he makes three films that make a statement on that: Compulsion, The Boston Strangler, and 10 Rillington Place. And all three of those are great films for different reasons. But I think it's Compulsion because I think you can see his, like, the subtle skill he brings to how he's matching style to substance. You see that in the way that he works with the actors to get the great performances. And then you see it in the message of the film. Um, that comes through by the end clearly. So I think if you were to start somewhere, and again, it is a tricky question because he's sprinkling so much of himself into so many of these different pictures in different ways that you can't. It's not like saying, well, obviously with Orson Welles, you would start with Citizen Kane, right? Why? Because that's the quintessential Welles film. I don't think there is a quintessential Fleischer film. I think there's a lot of different films that, when in aggregate you look at them, you say, oh, now I see what this director was able to accomplish. But I think if you're going to start somewhere, Compulsion is the best place to start.
Excellent, excellent. I mean, I've seen that, but your book made me want to rewatch it, and I'll put another couple of names on the list as well. So, final question, Jason. Could you give us a recommended film book?
Yeah, I think and this is not a recent book, but I'm a huge film noir fan, and so I think Foster Hirsch's book, Film Noir: The Dark Side of the Screen, is absolutely worth picking up and reading if you are interested in film noir. Hirsch's, he actually he presented with me at the Fleischer retrospective, and I mean he's got to be 80 at this point, and he's still going so strong. He's still got so much energy. He's working on another book right now. So there's that one, and then another Hirsch book that I just picked up. I haven't had a chance to read yet, so I'm kind of giving a blind recommendation. But I'm just obsessed with mid-century film and culture, and he just wrote a book called Hollywood and the Movies of the '50s, that dives deeply into the changing nature of Hollywood during that time. And that, to me, is that the period's so interesting because, one, bringing it back to Fleischer, I think that you know one of his skills was the ability to navigate Hollywood's shifting structure, business structure, and content standards. He just always found a way to keep working. When other directors were falling off in the '60s, when some of these studio directors had to move into television in
Mm.
the in the '60s because the work dried up in the '50s. He never did it. He never directed a single episode of television. I mean, he was able to stay in films all the way up to the end of his career because he had this ability to build relationships with people in the industry that allowed them to keep coming back to him over and over again when so many other directors that were quote unquote journeymen were not able to extend their careers. I mean, he's going all the way up to working with Dalton Trumbo on Call from Space at the end of the '80s with Show Scan, which was supposed to be the future of Hollywood, and it ends up not being that at all. But he loved experimentation, right? I mean, he loved to experiment. There are films of his that, you know, they don't use a musical score. There's several of his films where, you know, starting with The Narrow Margin, he thought, what if I used the sound effects as the score? And that was at a time when nobody was doing that. So I think that's why it's tricky to say, well, this is the one Fleischer film, because there's so many different ways he's experimenting over his career. And sometimes it works, like with the Boston Strangler, sometimes it doesn't work, but there's a lot of gems in there, you know, to find and to enjoy in his career. And that was part of the fun of writing the book.
And it's a lot of fun to read it as well. And it's going to be a lot of fun to read it and to go back and rewatch some of these films and watch some of these films, which I've discovered for the first time. Thank you so much, Jason, for writing the book and for joining me to talk about it.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. I appreciate it.
If you like the show, please take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe. It really does help the show to grow. Thank you for listening.